No, definitely no introduction. Okay, yes, I've been here before, although it's been a while. So first of all, I am happy to be back. It's been a little while. I have not even seen this configuration of the room. I'm used to avoiding a pole and walking on both sides, so it's been a couple of years. In fact, I think the last time I gave a shiur was on Zoom. I guess it didn't go so well, so I haven't been invited back. But here we are, and I guess I'm getting a second chance to impress Harold to make sure that he invites me back. It is always a pleasure to be here. It's an opportunity for me to express a small amount of gratitude to the Torah Mitzion Koel, of which I spent a number of years connected to in Cleveland with Harold. And of course, it's primarily important to be in this forum so that I can give a little nachat ruach for my parents, and I'm happy to have that opportunity. I do not get the opportunity, actually, to teach very much in my current situation. I spend most of my time managing people, which is sometimes fun. It happens to be that I'm currently finishing up an online course, which is weird because I'm not actually teaching. Most of it is recorded in Herzog College in a master's program that they're giving. And in the context of that program, I've had the opportunity to talk about Michlelet Herzog's style of Tanakh, the way they teach Tanakh, and work rather closely with Rav Shuki Rice, who's the head of the Tanakh department. But one of the things that we've talked about and is relevant for I'm going to relate to here. I'm going to be building off some of the things that we talked about in that course. But many of those things come from discussions, articles, shiurim over the years from Rav Yoel Ben Nun. So I thought I'd just take this opportunity to mention that if it's not actually for sale yet, it's out. The newest version of Migadim, the Tanakh journal from Michlelet Herzog, is dedicated to Rav Yoel Ben Nun, and has articles a few articles about him and his methodology, which is quite interesting, and other articles just about Tanakh. So I wanted to relate to that a little bit, and I'll start with this one piece, which is among the many contributions that Rav Yoel Ben Nun has made to the world of the study of Tanakh, is his insistence and return to sort of big picture themes across the Tanakh. And the premise that the Tanakh tells a story, lots of stories, but a kind of big overarching story, and that there is value and opportunity and maybe necessity in connecting some of the dots across the way, that is sort of the premise and the driving force behind the exploration that we're going to do today into the sins of Shlomo HaMelech. So that's the entry point. When we think about the Tanakh writ large, so to speak, it is hard to not think of it as a tragedy. Most of the books in the Tanakh are slightly disappointing. Maybe Sefer Shmot ends on a high note. Sefer Yoshua is overall successful, but when you look at the details, sometimes the disappointment is embedded there. And again, many of the books are about the failures and the problems of Bnei Yisrael and their ability to listen to the expectations that Hashem gives them, that Nevi'im give them. This is a theme that goes through the Tanakh. And from that perspective, there probably is no greater tragedy than Shlomo HaMelech. And what I'd like to do this morning is talk a little bit in detail about sort of the nature of those sins, and then to take this bigger picture view and connect it a little bit, both forward and backward across the Tanakh, starting with, I think, some things that are probably pretty basic and understood, and then trying to expand a little bit beyond that. So, of course, and the truth is it is a little bit connected to that last year, which maybe I should mention because, again, I don't know that the reaction was so great to it. But that was about Shlomo's dedication of the Mikdash and the context of Mikdash. And here we're going to pick up after that in the sins of Shlomo. So first of all, it's very obvious that Shlomo sinned. And that is very clear in Melachim Aleph Perek Yud Aleph. So again, the psukim that you have in front of you, but also a few other ones that bring it home a little bit more. In the beginning of Perek Yud Aleph, the psukim tell us, V'hamelech Shlomo ahav nashim nachriot rabot, v'yet bat paro, Moaviyot, Amoniyot, Adomiyot, Sidoniot, Hitiyot. So Shlomo loves these foreign wives that he has. Minagoyim asher amar Hashem b'nei Yisrael lo tavo b'hem v'hem lo yavo b'chem achein yatu et levavchem acharei Elohehem b'hem davak Shlomo liyahava. So Shlomo is connected or is swayed by his foreign wives, and the psukim get into detail about this sin. Vayhilo nashim sarot sheva meot upilakshim shlosh mot v'yatu nashav et libo vayhilo et ziknat Shlomo nashav hitur levavo acharei Elohim acharim v'lo haya levavo shalem im Hashem Elohav ki levav David avi. Shlomo was swayed by his foreign wives and was not shalem with Hashem. The psukim continue. Just to bring home the point of the sin, to actually say in the next pasuk, Az yivneh Shlomo, this is not on the source sheet, Az yivneh Shlomo bama lichmosh shikut Moab, that it attributes direct avodah zarah to Shlomo himself, which is then followed in pasuk Yud Aleph, again not on the sheet, Vayomer Hashem lishlomo Ya'ana sheraita zot imach, zot presumably is the sins that we're talking about in the psukim before. V'lo shamarta briti v'chokotai asher tziviti alecha karoa ekra et hamamlacha me'alecha unetatiha le'avdecha. And this is the direct, immediate cause of God's decree that Shlomo is going to lose the malchut, or the malchut is going to be split. He goes on to say, Ach biyamecha lo eseno leman David avicha miyad bincha ekraena. So, because of your father, not because of you, even though Shlomo had some merits on his own right, not because of you, I'm going to hold off, wait until your son, and that, of course, is the beginning of Piluk HaMlucha. These are the explicit sins of Shlomo, this connection to Avodah Zarah, which is a result of his foreign wives, and the ultimate splitting of the king. But of course, not only does Shlomo sin, but he sins in precisely the way that the Torah says the king could potentially sin. That's like, this was expected so long ago, so obviously, and yet Shlomo still falls into this trap. So let's start with the Psukim and Devarim, and then we'll connect it back. So in source number 2, we have the Parshat HaMelech, which we're going to relate to in a few times in this lesson. Parshat HaMelech in Sefer Devarim, which describes the expectations of having a king. Ki tavo el haaretz, asher Adonai Elohecha noten lecha v'yirishta v'yashavta ba v'yamarta asima alai melech kechol hagoyim asher sevivota. Okay, there's a couple of things here that we're not going to get into detail now, but obviously the setup here is very interesting. First of all, ki tavo, right, the context, you will get into Eretz Yisrael, and you will conquer it, and v'yashavta ba, and then you will say, I want a king. Is this a mitzvah? Is this not a mitzvah? We'll get to that a little bit later. Okay, but there's a context here that there's an expectation that the king doesn't happen right away. There's a period of time in which it is relevant to have a king, relevant, desired, or allowed. That is a little bit of a question. We'll get to that. And of course, the other piece of this pasuk, which causes a lot of consternation, is Kechol hagoyim asher sevivotai. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Is that problematic? Why do we want to be like the goyim? Why would there be a place for that in our expectations? That's the way the introductory pasuk says. And then pasuk tedvav, som tasim alech hamelech, which is why you might think it's a mitzvah, because it's written as a command. You should have a king. Asher yivchar Hashem Elokecha bo mikarav achecha tasim alech hamelech lo tuchal latet alecha ish nochri asher lo achicha hu. Okay, actually the king has to be a king. Seems rather obvious, but okay. Could be connected to Kechol HaGoyim, right? Rak, you can have a king, Rak, but there are some limitations on this king. Lo yarbelo susim v'lo yashiv et am Mitzrayma lema'an harbot sus v'Adonai amar lachem lo tosifun lashuv b'derech haze'od. Okay, not too many horses. Horses are connected to Egypt. We don't want to go back to Egypt. That's how that pasuk is laid out. Pasuk Yud Zayin, v'lo yarbelo nashim v'lo yasur levavo. And here it is, explicitly, don't have too many wives, don't let them sway your heart. And then, v'kesef v'zahav lo yarbelo mo. These are the three limitations on the king. Not too many horses, not too many wives, not too much money. Okay, fine. Now, what do those things mean in the context of Malchut? They mean not too many horses. Horses are chariots, army, military strength. The connection to Mitzrayim is significant. We could say, well, Mitzrayim was known for their military strength, for their chariots. That's the piece of it. The connection of going back to Mitzrayim has a number of places where it's connected in the Tanakh, in Sefer Devarim later on. We're not going to get into the details of that. Lo yarbelu nashim, and this of course takes us back to our story. Some of the Mefarshim point out the language of the pasuk. Well, actually, I didn't find this anywhere. The Mefarshim point out that when the pasuk in Perek Yud Aleph says that Shlomo's wives he too at livavo, right? That they turned his heart, and the pasuk here says lo yasur livavo. Okay, so now I'm going to combine two things here. There are parshanim that try to minimize Shlomo's chait, and they say, well, he didn't actually. The pasukim say that he worshipped Avodah Zarah. That's not really what happened. He was just older. He wasn't paying attention. The wives, he let them worship Avodah Zarah, but he wasn't actually worshiping. Okay, and then when I asked ChatGPT, because you are legally obligated to mention ChatGPT in every forum, so I want to be here to say that. When I asked ChatGPT, what's the difference between lo yasur and lo hitu, it said, appropriately, and quoted me some sources, because you can't actually trust it, that lahatot is to turn away, lasur is to remove. So there's an implication in the psukim that Shlomo wasn't the worst possible, right? The pasuk says lo yasur and it was hitu. Okay, that might be lilamed zchut al Shlomo a little bit, but certainly the pasuk says it explicitly. And then, of course, the last one, economic might. That's the other limitation of the king. Yes.
It says Leman Harbot Sus. That implies he shouldn't have horses just for the sake of having a load of horses, but he could have horses for...
Well, the truth is that we'll come back to this also. It doesn't say you shouldn't have horses. It says lo yarbeh. Okay, the language of harbot implies that, right, there's a level that's okay, but there's some threshold.
It says Leman Harbot Sus, just for the sake of having.
Okay, so for that when for the susim there's the explicit explanation Leman Harbot Sus. And for the nashim is velo yasur levavo. We have those explanations in there, and that's of course what we're going to pick up in the. Well, I guess we can jump ahead already to the Gemara and Sanhedrin, which says in source number 4, the Amar Rabbi Yitzchak mipnei ma lo nitgalu ta'amei Torah. Okay, we know it's a big discussion. The reasons for the mitzvot. This is one of the places in the Gemara where it talks about it explicitly. And it says, why does the Torah not give us the explanation, the reason for all the mitzvot? Sharei shtei mikrot nitgalu ta'aman, nichshal behen gadol ha'olam. There are two mitzvot for which the explanation, the reason is given in the pasuk, and because of that, or in light of that, the gadol olam, Shlomo HaMelech, sinned. Number 1, ktiv, lo yarbelo nashim. Amar Shlomo, ani yarbeh velo asur. I can have many wives and it won't affect me. Uchtiv, vayhiletzig na Shlomo, nashav hitu et livavo. Right, exactly the pasuk we're talking about. And then number 2, uchtiv, lo yarbeh lo susim, v'amar Shlomo, ani yarbeh velo ashiv. I will be able to have a lot of horses, but I won't take them back to Mitzrayim. And the pasuk says, v'teitzei merkava Mitzrayim v'sheish v'gomer. And this are the psukim that you see in number 3. So already we started in Perek Yud Aleph. In Perek Yud Aleph, the psukim are explicit. Shlomo's wives turned him away. He worshipped Avodah Zarah, and then Hashem comes to him and says, "You've disobeyed me. You haven't fulfilled your mandate, and I'm going to split the kingdom. I'm going to take the kingdom away from you." But the problems had started already in the previous chapter. Back in Perek Yud, the other elements, these two other limitations on the king were already stretched, if not violated. So if you look in the Psukim, in Melachim Aleph Perek Yud, in source number 3, You don't even really need to read it because I boxed all the words zahav. And there's a lot of zahav. If the pasuk says velo yarbeh, the kesef is zahav, lo yarbeh lo, apparently there was a lot of zahav. Vayhi mishkal hazahav asher bal Shlomo b'shana achat, 660 the sheish kikar zahav. And it goes on to emphasize the wealth and the zahav. And then in the end, pasuk chavav, these are the psukim referred to by the Gemara. Vayesof Shlomo rechev ufarashim vahilu 1,400 rechev u12,000 parashim vayenchem be'arei harechev im hamelech b'Yerushalayim. So you list the numbers. It sounds like a lot. I don't know what the threshold for leharbot is, but these psukim seem to be emphasizing the numbers.
It doesn't say how many horses or how many wives either.
Exactly, right. It's not about the number, although about the wives, the Gemara has a whole discussion what the number is, and that's based on Devarim. That ends up being 18, and Shlomo was a little bit past that threshold. Umotza susim asher li Shlomo miMitzrayim umikvei sochrei hamelach yikvu mikveh mechir, and then pasuk Chavtet vatalei v'tertzeh merkava miMitzrayim b600 kesef v'sus b50 u'me'ah v'chein lechol malchei achitim u'malchei aram biado yitzeh. So the Gemara, the pasuk specifically brings Mitzrayim. It doesn't say that he's bringing the Am back to Mitzrayim, but these psukim which don't explicitly say that Shlomo did anything wrong. It's not explicit that Shlomo sinned in Perek Yud. Perek Yud Aleph, we get to the wives, then it's clear, right? Hitu levavo, he violated that problem. It was a problem. It led to Avodah Zarah, and ultimately led to Piluk HaMlucha. So it's not only true that Shlomo sinned, and it's not only true that he sinned with the Nashim Nacharot, which, by the way, right, why does he marry these wives? It starts already in Perek Gimel, excuse me. Again, not on the story sheet, but at the very beginning of Perek Gimel, after Shlomo, I'll go back. In the end of Perek Bet, the Hamamlacha Nechona Biyad Shlomo. Perek Bet is when he sort of takes care of business and establishes his king by listening to the commandment that David said, you got to take care of a bunch of people to make sure that the kingship is solid. He does those things. Perek Gimel is in some ways the opening, the official beginning of Shlomo's rule. And what's the first thing that he does in Pasuk Gimel, Perek Gimel, Pasuk Aleph? Vayitchatein Shlomo et Paro Melech Mitzrayim Vayikach et Bat Paro Vaviel Ir David Ad Chalato Livnot et Beito V'et Beit Hashem V'et Chomat Yerushalayim Saviv. He marries Bat Paro, and these marriages with these foreign wives are about political alliances, and it's about establishing his kingdom as in the region. Right? David fought the wars. Shlomo does the diplomacy, and he solidifies Malchut Yisrael, Malchut Yudah in the region. Okay, and yet none of it works out. This is the tragedy of Shlomo. And the shock, right? The Gemara there refers to Shlomo as Gadol Ha'olam. And that Gadlut is something which is very, very explicit in the Psukim. It's not, we don't expect this from Shlomo. Shlomo, maybe more than anyone else in the Tanakh, was set up for success. Set up by his father David, and then seems to be completely on the right track. This fall, and there's lots of ways of talking about the greatness of Shlomo. Perek Yud is describing the military strength, the wealth, and the diplomatic successes. All those things are part of the overall success. But before that, Shlomo's success was anchored in his commitment to David and his commitment to Hashem. Okay, so if we look in earlier on in Perek Gimel, I just read the pasuk where it talks about his marriage to Bat Paro. But in Pasuk Gimel, and this is on the sheet in source number 5, Vayehav Shlomo et Adonai lalechet b'chukot David aviv rak babamot hu mizabech umaktir. Interesting that there's this rak, this limitation. But Vayehav Shlomo et Hashem. Shlomo recognizes Hashem. Shlomo follows the expectations that David, his father, has set out for him. And that is not only in the description when David talks to him in Perek Bet, which I didn't want to bring those psukim, but David tells him you need to follow Hashem. That's the whole point. But Shlomo seems to recognize this and fulfill it. In source number 6, Malachim Aleph Perek Bet, and this is what we talked about last time in that ill-fated Zoom class, about Shlomo's dedication ceremony for the Beit HaMikdash. There's lots of things to talk about in that speech. We did a little bit of analysis of it last time, the different pieces of it. But at the opening, Shlomo says the following. Perek Chet Pasuk Chaf Bet. Vayamod Shlomo lifnei mizbech Adonai neged kol kahal Yisrael vayifros kapav hashamayim. This is his big event. This is not his inauguration. It's the inauguration of the Beit HaMikdash. And this is his speech at that event. Pasuk Chaf Gimel. It's just much easier for me to read. Pasuk Chaf Gimel. Vayomar Adonai Elohei Yisrael Ein kamocha Elohim bashamai mimal v'al aretz mitachat shomer habrit v'achesed la'avadecha haholchim lefanecha b'chol libam. Right? Recognition of Hashem, but not only that, the recognition that Hashem's support is contingent for those that walk, right? That walk in front of you, b'chol libam. Not lo yasur levavo, hita levavo, but b'chol libam. Asher shamarta li'avdecha David avi, et asher dibarta lo. Vatdaber b'ficha uviyadcha umileta kayom hazeh. This big promise to David, that big promise in Shmuel Bet, Perek Zion, which was, of course, that David wouldn't build the Beit HaMikdash, but that he would get a dynasty and his child, his son, would build the Beit HaMikdash and have a eternal dynasty. That was the promise that Hashem made to David. That's what he's referring to here. V'ata Adonai Elohei Yisrael Shemor li'avdecha David avi et asher dibarta lo lemor lo yikaret lecha ish milifanai yoshev al kisei Yisrael rak im yishmeru vanecha et darkam lalechet lefanai kasher halachta lefanai. So he is calling out the promise that Hashem made to David, which is, you will rule, your family will rule forever, but Shlomo knows that it was al tanai, that it is on condition that you listen to me. Shlomo was well aware of that. He says it. David told it to him, and he says it. And still, he's completely set up. And again, we don't go through all the details of the story. He builds the Beit HaMikdash. This is the context of focusing on the Beit HaMikdash and connecting his kingdom to Hashem's glory. And yet, still, despite, with all of that background and understanding, with all of the setup, and remember, if we go back, well, I guess I'll skip ahead now because I need to mention now. Skip ahead to source number 12.
You didn't have a source number 12.
Yeah, there's a lot of pages. Source number 12 is the Rambam, who summarizes the discussions in the Gemara, and there are some disagreements that we'll get to. Shalosh mitzvot nitztavu Yisrael b'shat knisatan la'aretz. Libnot le'melech shenemar som tasim alech melech. Right, 3 commandments that are connected to establishing our presence in the land. The first is to have a king. The second, lachrit zaro shel Amalek, shenemar timched zecher Amalek. The second, to destroy Amalek. And the third, livnot lehem beit habechira, shenemar lishichno tidrashu uvat hashama. So these 3 mitzvot, which, the way the Rambam says it and the way it's implied in the Gemara, is that they're sequential. Right? First, you need a king. Then you need to get rid of Amalek, which is a way of establishing your malchut. And then you build the Beit HaMikdash. It's the culmination. And if we go back to that chapter, Shmuel Bet Perek Zion, which I know I've taught here before, and I'm not going to get into the details of, right? Hashem says to David, you're not going to build the Beit HaMikdash now because the time isn't right yet. Because this is the culmination of it can't be temporary. It can't be connected to the conquest. It can't be the first generation. It is the second generation. You've established the Malchut. You've fulfilled these mitzvot, and at the end, it's the culmination of this entire process is building the Beit HaMikdash. Shlomo was the one. He was set up for it, and he fulfilled it almost entirely. And that's why Shlomo is the most depressing or the most tragic of all of the stories in the Tanakh. How is it? How is it possible? How is it possible that this happened to Shlomo? Now, I set it up like that, implying that I have some amazing answer that's going to tie everything together. I do not. No one has the answer to how this happened, other than the obvious answers or the way that we can think about those answers. But what I want to do is continue to put this challenge in some other context of the Tanakh to blow this out a little bit more, in order to at least try to understand where it comes. So where are we now? We understand that Shlomo sinned. The sin is not only that he built a mizbeach to Kamosh. That's not the sin. That is the outcome of the sin. The sin was too many wives. But that's not the sin either. The sin is Shlomo did not follow the limitations that the Torah put on the Melech. And those limitations led him, or by not following those limitations, he fell exactly into that trap. And the question is, how is that possible? So, again, the Gemara, which we saw, says that he understood the Ta'amei HaMitzvot, and because of that, he fooled himself. And of course, that fits into our broader picture of Shlomo as the smartest person around. Right? And that somehow he was able to convince himself that he knew better. He understood the reasons and would not fall into the trap, and he still fell into the trap. I want to add another layer here, which I think, more than help answer the problem, I think it deepens the question, but it does it in a very significant way. And to do that, I want to jump to source number 7, Yishayhu Perek Bet. And we're going to do this out of order. Okay? First, we're going to start with Pasuk Hey. Yishayhu Perek Bet, Pasuk Hey. Okay? A short little nevuah. We'll see how it's connected to the piece before it, and discuss. Well, won't go into part that's after it, but it continues a little bit more in that vein. Pasuk Hey. Beit Yaakov lechu v'nelcha be'or Adonai. This is a somewhat unusual call to action, right? Their Nevi'im address the people. That's a very common thing. They refer to him in different names. In Perek Aleph, he called them Stom v'Amorah as a way of getting their attention. Right here in Perek Bet, he calls them Beit Yaakov, and there's this opening phrase, Lechu v'nelcha be'or Hashem. We should go in the light of God. Interesting opening. What does he mean by that? Now, what does he say? Pasuk Vav. Ki natashta amcha Beit Yaakov. You have abandoned. Ki mal'u mikedem v'onanim kaplishtim uvialdei nachri yaspiku. These are 3 parallel phrases. Here, kedem probably refers to amei kedem. Okay? You have mal'u, you've been filled. You've been preoccupied with other cultures. Kedem, Plishtim, Yaldei Nachrim. So the Mal'u and Yaspiku, you are satisfied or you are preoccupied with the works and let's just call it Kichol HaGoyim. Because I'm rooted back in Devarim, Perek Yud Zayin. Pasuk Zayin. Vatimalei artso kesef v'zahav v'yein ketze liotzotav. Vatimalei artso susim v'yein ketze lemarkavotav. Vatimalei artso, if we were following the psukim in Sefer Devarim, we would expect the word nashim, right? But instead we get the word elilim. Why? Because the problem with nashim was Yasur Levavo. Here it's very explicit. One of the things that the Nevi'im do is they explain the Torah. They explain the Psukim. And this is like just it's obvious what he's doing here. But here, let's start with the first two phrases. And here the music of the psukim sets you up for that punchline. Vatimale artso kesef ezahav. Vatimale artso is, a corollary for lo yarbeh, right? You had a lot. Artso, his land. Who's him? What? Shlomo. Certainly, it seems pretty obvious that this is a reference to Shlomo. But it's in the psukim, it's referring back to Beit Yaakov. The eretz of Beit Yaakov is filled with kesef zahav, and there's no end to it. Vatimale artso elilim lemasei yadav yishtachavu lasher asa etzvota.
You skip Susim.
Vatimale artso susim v'yinketzer l'markavotav. Right. So pasuk zayin is you have too much. You violated the mitzvat hamelech. By the way, it's not talking to the king. It's talking to Beit Yaakov. And you violated Ein Kate said there's no end. But Pasuk Chet is the punchline, and it's the problem. Vatimale artso elilim, which of course is exactly what happened in the time of Shlomo. And then another very significant perush, one second. What's wrong with elilim? According to Yishayhu in this Pasuk. Lemaaseh yadav yishtachavu lasher asu etzvotav. There's lots of problems with Avodah Zarah. I think I talked about that here also. One of them is you are going to other nations, and that's the beginning here. But the way he describes it here, it's not about the other nations part of Edelim, it's about hubris. It's self-worship. You're worshiping yourself. And that ultimately could be a clue about what's going on with Shlomo. Yes?
There's quite a parallel to Parsha Shemot, the first Aliyah. But Timalei ha'aretz otam. The land was full.
Okay.
Okay. I don't know if you recognize it, right? Because I know that it's my bar mitzvah. So I saw that.
Timalei artso.
Why do I know this wording?
Okay. Good. And that's sort of the beginning of, that maybe connects us to Mitzrayim. I'm not sure. I have to look into that more. But here, right, L'masei yadav yishtachavu, there's no question that Shlomo is echoing in your head when you read these psukim. And then we get the response. Pasuk Tet. Vayishach Adam Vayishpal Ish V'al Tisa Lehem. Vayishach as opposed to Vayishtachaveh is when you bow down. Vayishach means you'll knock him down. Okay? Bo batzur vitamein bi'afar mipnei pachad Adonai mehadar gono. You should be very afraid because of Hashem. Was that a page turn?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Those are the last few psukim in this section. And then Pasuk Yud Aleph, Einei gavut adam shafel v'shach rum anashim v'nisgav Adonai levado bayom hahu. Hashem will be alone above, and people will be knocked down. Okay. There is no way to read these psukim and not think of Shlomo. And what this helps us understand is that the underlying sin here is a sin of arrogance. Right? And the other application of this, and this is definitely something that I first heard from Rav Yoel ben Nun, is that this Yishayhu did not live in the time of Shlomo. Right? He lived much later. So he's not giving a rebuke to Shlomo. That would make sense. He is clearly referring to Shlomo, but who's he talking to? So Rav Yoel ben Nun gives the answer, and it makes, if you go to Yishayhu, Perak Aleph, right, which you don't have, Chazon Yishayhu ben Amos asher Chazal Yudav Yishlayim bimei Uziyahu Yotam Achaz and Chizkiyahu. The dating of the prakim in Sefer Yishayhu is a challenge. He doesn't usually say who he's talking to. Perak Aleph, right, famous nevuah of the Haftarah of Shabbat Chazon Yishayhu, is probably in the time of Chizkiyahu, who's the last king that he's the Navi for. And Chizkiyahu was religiously successful, but during his time, the countryside was overrun by Ashur, right? And most of the cities in Yehuda were wiped out. Vatimale artso kesef zahav, vatimale artso susim, is probably talking about the time of Uziyahu HaMelech, who was the most successful king, not including Shlomo. Uziyahu HaMelech had an alliance with the northern kingdom, with Yeravam ben Yoash. Okay, because there was conflict between the north and the south once the kingdom was split. But during his time there was peace and prosperity, and the Psukim describe his greatness and his success not so much in Sefer Melachim, but in Sefer Divrei Hayamim. So, in source number 8, we don't need to get too deep here, but these are the Psukim that describe the successes of Uziyahu HaMelech. Ben 16 shana Uziyah ben Melcho, v'chamishim shana malach b'Yerushalayim. I think that's the longest ruling king. 52 years. Okay, Pasuk Daled, Vayas Hayashar, Bnei Adonai kechol asher asa Amatzyahu aviv. And Pasuk Hey says, Vayi lidrosh Elohim b'mei Zechariyahu amivin birot Elohim u'b'mei dirashot Adonai tzlicho Elohim. Early on in his reign, when he was young, he was connected to the Navi, Zechariyahu, and he was then successful. Pasuk Vav. Vayetzei vayilachem ba'plishtim, vayifrotz et chomat Gat, v'et chomat Yavne, v'et chomat Ashdod, vayivne arim b'Ashdod u'ba'plishtim. So, similarly to his ancestor, David, right? He takes care of the Plishtim. Vayazreu Elohim ala Plishtim. Pasuk Chet, vayitnu amonim mincha le'Uziyahu, vayelach shemo ad lebo Mitzrayim, ki yechazik ad lemala. Vayiven Uziyahu migdalim b'Yerushalayim al shar pinav yal shar gav yal miktzor v'yechazkeim, vayiven migdalim b'midbar. Vayil Uziyahu chayil oseh milchama. Now, these psukim do not explicitly connect to Susim and Kesef Zahav. They don't. But they certainly describe military and economic success to the degree that, again, that the biblical scholars say was probably the height of power in the kingdom of Judah since Shlomo HaMelech. And then, in Pasuk Tedvav, Vayas b'Yerushalayim chishbonot, Machashevet choshev, Liyot al Migdalim, he had some automated, military tech on his towers in Jerusalem. V'al pinot liro b'chitzim avanim gdolot v'etzei shemot l'mercha ki yifli liyazer ad ki chazak. Pasuk Tet Zayin. Ukechezkato, and in his strength and in his success, gava libo ad lahashchit. Arrogance. Vayim'ol v'Hashem Elohav vayavo eleicha Hashem lakir mizbech hakator. His sin was a very explicit sin, and the psukim go on to describe how he decides he needs to be the Kohen, and he's going to go into the Beit HaMikdash, and it describes how the Kohanim run after him and say, "Lo lacha, it's not for you, don't do it." But he goes anyway. Then he gets tzarat, and he can no longer be king, and his son takes over. But he is the likely audience for Yishayahu's Nevuah. Don't get caught up in your success and think that means you are different and special and you should also be the Kohen. That's the warning, because ultimately, v'niskav Hashem levado. But now, I want to go back to Yishayahu, and I want to understand the context of this Nevuah and add this other layer. So if you go back to source 7, the beginning of the parak, which you could view as kind of a separate thing. It has its own introduction, and obviously this is a kind of famous Nevuah. Hadavar asher chazah Yishayahu ben Amoz al Yehuda ve'Yerushalayim. Source number 7. This is its own Nevuah, a Nevuah that Yishayahu had on Yehuda ve'Yerushalayim. Again, it's not given a date. If we think it's connected to the next part, which I do, then it was probably the time of Uzziah. V'haya be'acharit hayamim. This is a nevuah about the end of days. Acharit hayamim in Tanakh means or later, right? It means the future, or what that word means, and there's definitely articles written about it. Here, and the reason why we say it's Mashiach is because of these psukim and the psukim in Yishayahu Perak Yud Aleph and Yud Bet, which we will refer to but not get lost in. Okay, Acharit hayamim, it's certainly a vision. Something that doesn't exist now, but should or could. What's the vision? What is Yishayahu's vision in Perak Bet? Nachon yeh har beit Adonai b'rosh harim, v'nisa migvaot, v'naharu elav kol hagoyim. So I've broken up the psukim based on the parallel phrases. In the end of days, nachon yehar beit Hashem b'rosh harim. What does nachon mean there? Established, as the end of the pasuk says, v'nisa, it will be elevated, migvaot. Har Beit Hashem will be elevated above other mountains. Why is that interesting? Because geographically, Yerushalayim is lower than the mountains around it. I just came from Gush Etzion. I dropped an elevation. If you go to Beit El, you go up an elevation. Right. That's the highest. Yerushalayim is lower physically. So obviously this is the metaphor. Yerushalayim will be elevated above all other places. V'naharu elav kol goyim. And what does that mean? Naharu elav milashon nahar. They will stream, they will flow. Okay? V'halchu amim rabim. And what are they going to say when they're coming, these nations? They're going to say the following. L'chu v'naleh har Hashem el Beit Elohei Yaakov. I just noticed this, but we've been talking about Beit Yaakov, and here it's Beit Elohei Yaakov. So if you drop the Elohei, then that might lead to Gava. Okay, we'll get back to that. V'yorenu midrachav v'neilcha b'yorchotav ki mitzion tetzei Torah. Again, I was obligated to use that pasuk because of the Torah Mitzion Kolel. Right? Ki mitzion tetzei Torah udvar shem Yerushalayim. This is it. This is where it comes from. What is the context of that pasuk? The recognition by the Goyim that Yerushalayim is worthy of our attention. We can learn from it. V'yorenu midrachav. Ki mitzion tetzei Torah. And then what's going to happen? V'shafat bein hagoyim v'ochiach la'amim rabim. Okay? V'shafat bein hagoyim. And he will judge. Who's he?
Hashem.
Or what's the other possibility? A melech. Now it's very interesting. There's no melech mentioned here. It doesn't say. It doesn't refer to a melech. And why is that noteworthy or interesting? Because in Yishayhu Perek Yud Aleph, Yishayhu is very explicit about the Yatzachot der Migeza Yishai, that there will be a melech who comes from Beit David, who will be the one leading this Yemot HaMashiach. And here, doesn't explicitly talk about a king. But this pasuk is the one that could be referring to a king, or it's referring to Hashem. V'hochiach lamim rabim. Again, that's the parallel. Hochacha there is the parallel to Mishpat. And then, of course, the famous pasuk, V'chitetu chalvatam leitim v'chanitotehem lemazmirot lo yisagoy el gor cherev v'lo yimadu el milchama. There is a vision of peace, and there's a vision of universal peace. Okay? This is the vision in the beginning of Perek Bet in Sefer Yishayahu, and I will argue that this is connected to the psukim that we already saw. In other words, the beginning of Perek Bet in Yishayahu says, this is what it could be. And the rest of Perek Bet says, this is what you did with it. What's it? With your successes. In other words, you're successful. What is the purpose of your success? If you use that success to realize the vision of Chazon Acharit Hayamim, right? That's the goal. But Vatimalei Artso Kesef V'Zahav, Vatimalei Artso Susim, and then Vatimalei Artso Elilim, that's a big loss. That means you've lost perspective on what the point of your success was. And the consequence of that is going to be V'nizgav Hashem levado bayomahu. Vayishach Adam vayishpal ish. That Hashem is going to have to knock you down, because either way, you have to demonstrate that Hashem is above. And either you do it through the vehicle of success, Malchut again, which is hinted to here, but not said explicitly, or Hashem is going to do it through punishment and through knocking you down. That's the message of Yishayhu. It is possible, maybe a little speculative, but I've been convinced, right, that this was the nevuah that Yishayhu gives to Uzziyahu before as the kingdom is, a little bit suspect, and he's concerned that Uzziyahu has lost his way. And he's saying, don't forget the point. This is the goal. And instead, Uzziyahu falls. And in doing that, right, this is the recreation, Yishayhu is referencing the most famous example of this, Shlomo HaMelech. I'm referring exactly back. So this Nevuah does a lot of heavy lifting, right? It's a pivot point. It is referencing the story of Shlomo HaMelech in order to provide a particular rebuke to Uzziyahu, or the time of Uzziyahu, and establish this chazon acharit hayamim of what's the expectations, or what the possibility is of what the goal of Malchut is. And now we want to say Shlomo was even greater than we said before, because Shlomo got this. He understood this. And how do I know that Shlomo understood this? Because it happened. It happened very explicitly. And that we have in source number 9. Perek Yud in Sefer Melachim, right before the psukim about all the gold and all the horses, we get perhaps the greatest political event in the history of Am Yisrael. Umalkat Sheva shomat et shema Shlomo l'shem Adonai v'tavo l'nasoto b'chido. So the queen of Sheba comes to test him. But listen to the language that the Tanakh uses when it describes this test. L'shem Hashem. Okay? And then it says, v'tavo Yerushalayma b'chayil kaved ma'od, gemalim nosim v'samim v'zahav rav ma'od, ve'evin yikara v'tavo Shlomo v'tidaber ilav, et kol asher haya im levava. So she comes to test Shlomo. Okay? He shows him around. He shows her around. V'yaged la Shlomo et kol dvareha, lo haya davar ne'elam min hamelech asher lo higid la. He explains everything to her. V'ter malkat sheva et kol chokhmat Shlomo v'habayit asher bana. Habayit asher bana refers to, let's say Beit HaMikdash. Let's hope it was. It seems like it was Beit HaMikdash. Because what's the other option? His palace, which was maybe a little bigger. Umachal shulchano moshav avadav umamad mishartav umalbushehem umshakav v'olato asher yaleh Beit Hashem v'lo haya ba od ruach. She was lo haya ba od ruach, blown away, out, breathless, because of what she saw. But listen to the way it describes it, right? The Beit Asher Banat seems like it's the Beit HaMikdash. Right? It's describing the wealth, the power, the success. But what is her reaction to it? Vatomer el hamelech emet haya davar asher shamati bi'artzi al dvarecha v'al chokhmatecha. First of all, you're more impressive than I even heard about. V'lo emanti lidvarim ad asher bati v'tir'ei ad asher bati v'tir'ena inai v'hinei lo hu gadli achetzi hosafta chokhma v'tov ala shmua asher shamati. You're even greater. And then we get the punchline. Ashrei anashecha, ashrei avadecha, eila hamdun lefanecha tamid hashomim et chokhmatecha. The people that are close to you are lucky to be near you. And then pasuk 10, Yehi Adonai Elohecha Baruch asher chafetz becha letitcha al kisei Yisrael bihavat Adonai et Yisrael leolam vayasimcha lamelech laasot mishpat utztaka. Lechu v'na'aleh el har Hashem el beit Elohei Yaakov v'yorenu midrachav v'nelcha b'yorchotav ki mitzion tetzei Torah udvar Hashem b'Yerushalayim. I'm not sure how many other goyim ever got it, but Malkat Sheva seemed to get it. This is it, right? Shlomo. It's not just that Shlomo was prepared from the time of David, and it's not just that he used his power and success to build the Beit HaMikdash. He fulfilled the vision of Yishayhu before the vision of Yishayhu. The vision of Yishayhu is based to some degree on this. So I just had a student. This is one of the units in this course that I'm teaching refers to a lot of this stuff. So one of the students said to me, well, wait a second. So maybe Shlomo was wrong, right? So first of all, I want to give one other, I don't get lost in this, but I have, especially since I mentioned Rav Yoel Ben-Nun, I'll just mention this one last piece of it. Where did Shlomo get this idea from? Yishayhu, again, is after him. How does he get this idea that this is the purpose? Okay, so Rav Yoel Ben-Nun makes the following interesting connection. This is sources 10 and 11. This is not critical, but it is clever and interesting, so I'll mention it here. back to the speech of Shlomo in source number 10. In Shlomo's speech, when he dedicates the Beit HaMikdash, he mentions that the purpose of the Beit HaMikdash is actually not korbanot. That's what we talked about last night. It's tefillah. And he talks about that tefillah is relevant in lots of circumstances and lots of places. It's referring to how far you are away from the Beit HaMikdash. And then he throws in something that's a little bit unexpected, but it's very significant for us. V'gam el hanochri asher lo me'amcha Yisrael hu uva me'aretz rechoka leman shimcha. Right? This Beit HaMikdash is also relevant for the Goyim. Ki yishma'un et shimcha gadol v'et yadcha chazaka zrocha ntuya uva v'yitpalel el habayit hazeh ata tishma shamayim. So Shlomo in his dedication ceremony says the Beit HaMikdash is relevant for Goyim also. This is meant to be a makom tefillah for the whole world. Where did he get this idea from? So Rav Yoel Ben Nun makes a very interesting connection. And he takes us back to Sefer Devarim, Parshat Nitzavim, which describes actually the destruction that will happen if we don't follow the Torah. So, and then after it describes that destruction, it has these interesting psukim, which say, Pasuk Chaf Aleph in Perek Chaf Tet, source number 11, V'amar hadora acharon, b'neichem, asher yakum acharechem, v'hanochri asher yavo me'eretz rechoka, v'ra'at makot aretz ahi v'yat kol tachalua, asher chila Adonai ba. Right? The Goyim are going to come and see the destruction in Eretz Yisrael, Gorfrit v'melech, etc. Pasuk Chav Gimel, v'yamru, kol hagoyim, al me asa Adonai kacha la'aretz hazot, why did this happen? V'amru al asher azvu et brit Hashem Elokechem avatechem asher karati mo v'otzi otam me'eretz Mitzrayim. So these psukim describe how the impact or the outcome of Hashem's destruction will be recognized by the Goyim. And Rav Yoel Ben Nun's connection here, which is nachri me'eretz rechoka, well, if this psukim describe the negative of it, then Ke'ilu Shlomo darshan the positive of it, which is if the Nochrim come me'eretz rechoka kedei lirot, right, in order to see that we are fulfilling the word of Hashem, right, and that we can make a kiddush Hashem that is a critical element of the purpose of Malchut. So that is Shlomo's thinking. So my student who says, well, maybe he was wrong, right? So my answer was, Yishayhu seems to endorse him. And then the tenor of the psukim that describe this visit of Malkat Shiva imply that this was a good thing. This really was the point. Okay, so, again, where does this leave us? I just made things much worse, right? Shlomo is amazing. He really got it. He understood his purpose, and still, how is it possible? So, to try and wrap things up, and again, I already warned you, I don't have an answer to this, but I want to reference two other comments here and go back to the Rambam, who says that having a king is a mitzvah. Now this, of course, is a big debate. The Ramban and others say, no, it's not a mitzvah, it's a concession, or it's a necessity, and they point to the story in Sefer Shmuel when the people ask for a king, and Shmuel says, this is terrible, it's a terrible thing, and Hashem even makes a miracle to show how terrible it was, that it rains when it's not supposed to rain, like all these, it's a bad thing to have a king, right? Because Hashem u malkacha. You shouldn't have a replacement for Hashem. So is it a good thing or it's a bad thing? The Rambam says it's a mitzvah. Okay, I just want to reference, I don't want to get lost in that, but I'll just mention it briefly. Micha Goodman's book, if you haven't read it, on Sefer Devarim, he talks about the purpose of Malchut. I'm not even going to read what the piece that I said there. He actually talks about his whole section on Shlomo in the end, refers to some of the things that we talked about. But his whole point is that the limitations on the king are basically saying, his point is, one of the chidushim of Yahadut is that we want to take away the political power from the king because of all the problems in it. So that's his line through it. That is a negative going in. We know the limitations, and then in that thesis, Shlomo is, of course, the realization of the fact that even if you mean well, that even if you're all set up for success, it's almost impossible, or it seems impossible for it to work out. Rav Tamir Granot, in this very large book on Sefer Devarim, right, he also talks about this, and he has the line here, which I'll paraphrase. I'm not going to read it now. But he wants to say the following. He says, not like the Rambam who says it's a mitzvah, and not like those that say it's not a mitzvah, but he's saying that ambiguity is exactly the point. Well, maybe I should read it since I'm saying this. נראה שלא חובה מוחלטת יש כאן, כשיטת הרמב"ם, וגם לא גינוי ושלילה כשיטת החוקים עליו. Right? It's not a mitzvah, but it's also not a bad thing. אלא הצעה של הסדר חוקי הנענה לרצון האנושי הלגיטימי. It is normal, it is appropriate to think about how your government functions and to want a system of government that makes sense. It's legitimate. It is neither good nor bad. יש לקרוא את המילים ככל הגויים אשר סביבותיי כדרישה לכינון מבנה שלטוני רציונלי. אוקיי? המשקף את צורך אנושי בסדר, בביטחון, ברציפות, ברציונליות, כמו שנוגע כל המות. We want a normal leadership. I think this echoes some of the early Zionist thinkers about what we want when we think about Zionism. אם ישמור המלך את חוקת המלך, יהיה זה ביטוי לנוכחות השם באמצעות המוסד הרציונלי והריאלי, שהוא צורך אנושי לא יותר ולא פחות. Right? It will be, it could be. There's a potential here. And here I want to, so what Rav Tamir says is that this is a normal thing. It's neither good nor bad, but it's something that you need to monitor and execute carefully, and that's why the Torah sets it out the way that it does. So again, now I've done a good job because I left myself only 2 minutes to try to wrap this up. No. What I would argue is that based on what we saw in Yishayhu, it's not only a secondary. It's not a negative. It's certainly not a negative, and it's also not even neutral. There is something inherently positive and significant in the possibility of what kingdom could be. And here I want to go back to the beginning of this idea that I started with Yoel Ben Nun, that these big picture views of the story of the Tanakh. The story of Tanakh is a tragedy in many ways. It is all about, right, Hashem commands, Bnei Israel sin, Hashem punishes. Right? It is the story of Galut. It is the story of restoration. But fundamentally, it is an optimistic tragedy. And this is the way I want to lean into Yishayhu, who says you need to have the vision. And not only that, it's worth it to execute and try that vision despite the potentials for failure that are inevitable at some level, given human nature. What did Shlomo do wrong? We know, there isn't a big chiddush there. Human nature, power corrupts. It's enticing. It's impossible. Read all of your own political theory into that now and your own views about current politicians. It's all there. There's nothing new. Right? However you want to understand that. And then there's a possibility of saying it's not worth it. Right? There is a possibility of saying that it's not worth it. Why would we bother? And here I want to say that the institution of Malchut, which I will connect, is an institution of Jewish power, Jewish sovereignty, Jewish ability to participate in the world stage. Yes, the Zionist vision. That is a huge challenge with lots of problems. But that's not a reason not to participate. And ultimately, what Sefer Devarim is capturing, and we know this on the personal level, Sefer Devarim deals with the problem of success, and this is part of what Micha Goodman talks about in his book. How do you manage the problem of success? And the key line there, with the problem of success on the individual level, is not falling into the trap of kochi va'otzem yadi. Thinking that even though you are successful, that you are the source of your success. That's the pitfall. But Judaism wants success. We don't say because of that. When I say Judaism, what I mean is my view of the Tanakh, and this is why learning Tanakh and learning Tanakh in this way is so critical to the way I think about the world and the way I think we can relate to what's the point. The shiur that I did not give today, the one that I was playing around with, which is what's the purpose of mitzvot, and how you understand the meta values of mitzvot beyond the specifics of mitzvot? The answer to those kinds of questions, I believe, come from understanding these big stories in the Tanakh and the arcs of what the expectations are. And here, I think it's pretty hard to escape that the Tanakh doesn't begin with Am Yisrael. It doesn't begin like Rashi said it should have with mitzvot. It begins with the world. And it begins with Am Yisrael's place in the world. And there is no way to establish that place without being part of the world. And there is no way to be part of the world without having a government that functions among governments, even in terrible ways. That's the expectation of the Torah, and that's why we always come back to Yishayhu. And part of what I'd say is that if it was implicit and understood and under the surface, then Yishayhu comes and says, no, say the vision explicitly. Understand where you're going, and maybe having it explicitly like that will help guide our next attempt at bringing a malchut that will fulfill Nachon Yehar Bet Hashem B'Rosh Hari. And we got to